Hello and welcome as we come now to the eighth Sunday, and this will be the last of the continuing Sundays following the celebration of Epiphany, because this coming week we will begin the new season of Lent on Wednesday. So just as a kind of a little reminder that things are going to be changing. But the readings that are chosen for this time, the first reading comes from the book of Sirach, chapter 27, verses 4 through 7. Again, the concluding part of chapter 15 of Paul's letter to the first letter to the Corinthians, verses 54 through 58. As we have noticed on other occasions, this particular section, chapter 15, in Paul's letter to the Corinthians is perhaps one of the most important in our tradition, because it is Paul's explanation and development of the meaning of and the importance of Jesus' resurrection. And finally, the gospel selection from Luke chapter 6, verses 39 through 45. So, keeping in mind that over the last couple of weeks we have been looking at material from chapter 6 of Luke's Gospel, we have even talked about the fact that the work, and this was known as the Sermon on the Plain, you will remember, this particular chapter has been divided. Now, it's interesting that different authors have divided the material into different sections. So one writer or author or interpreter divides it into 5 parts. Namely, Jesus begins with exhorting a little bit his disciples. Then secondly, he says that you have to love even your enemies. Then thirdly, this would be verses 37, 30, 40, 42, don't judge one another. Fourth section would be 43, 45, the role of good deeds. And finally, 46 through 49, the need to act on words. Okay, it's one thing to say something, it's important to follow through. However, another author only divides it into 4 parts. Not that it matters a whole lot, but the first part would be the blessing and woes. We've seen that. Second part would be the relationships that you have with enemies and benefactors. The third part would be the importance of mercy and judgment. And the fourth part would be personal integrity. Now, again, to emphasize that this whole section of Luke's work is directed toward Luke's community. And as we have noted, and we will have opportunity again and again to point this out, that the community of believers that Luke represents or is addressing seems to be a community of believers who would have been rather well off, at least financially. In other words, they were not the poor, even in the larger sense of the poor, including those who are physically poor, widows and orphans. Certainly they are addressed here, but the community of believers, and it's interesting that all of this is a kind of important background to appreciating the work of Luke X in terms of the material that was being presented, and even at the time in which it was being offered. All right, again, all of that, a little bit of a review. This time we come toward the end of this chapter, keeping in mind that these chapters were developed later on by different interpreters. All right, let's develop a little bit here. One of them is that can a blind person lead a blind person, or will they not all fall into a pit? Now, the idea of sight here And in fairness to Luke, sight here is not simply physical sight, but also what we would call, and he uses this as a metaphor, a spiritual understanding of things. So when you lose your sight or you are blind, it doesn't necessarily mean that, blindness is wrong. And I think, we need to maybe be a little bit certainly more aware of the fact here that if the teacher is blind, so will the student be blind. Well, this illustration of blindness may be an exaggeration, because in our own time, and even in the first century and the times gone by, there were certainly blind people who were very capable of leading and of teaching. Homer, of course, whose works everyone knows, the Iliad and the Odyssey, was blind. So and certainly his work is a marvelous contribution to the thinking of ancient times and to the tradition of Hellenic or Greco thinking. Teresi, who was a seer of the first century time, who kind of could see things, was blind. And certainly in our own time, she was born in 1880 and died in 1968. One of the most amazing women in the course of our Western history was Helen Keller, whom you remember was not only blind but also had other physical defects, and yet she was a remarkable person, had remarkable insights into life. So before we're too quick to kind of say, can a blind person lead a blind person, and make the claim that no, they can't, and that's the way in which the gospel seems to want us to interpret this, may not be quite factually correct, right? So I mention all of this as we hear how this will be developed, certainly homiletically, in our talks. And I think here Luke is, again, using a characteristic sometimes he likes, a bit of exaggeration. Can a blind person lead a blind person without any kind, yes, they both would probably fall into a pit if there was no kind of other factors coming into play here. But, as I say, you never know. Here, it would seem, and this is something that Luke in this section has been kind of directing his attention to, is toward the teachers and leaders. The Pharisees are the ones that he singles out here, who he accuses of being experts at playing theater roles. Now, you remember that the Greek word here for that is a hypocrite. And we have had many discussions about what it means to be a hypocrite. But keep in mind that the Greek word here, meaning to put on the mask, which is certainly what good actors would often do, hypocrite could also mean, by the way, an interpreter, an expounder of insight, an orator, a stage actor, but it could also be a deceiver, someone who puts on a mask to hide the truth so that the audience would not certainly get it, okay? So, perhaps underlining a lot of this material this time is, who can you trust? Now, in the synoptic tradition, which is Matthew, Mark, or Luke, Luke is the only gospel in which Jesus uses the word hypocrite to criticize people whom he accuses, and that would be the way in which apparently Luke is talking to his community, that they are misguided teachers. So there's a lot of, see how the imagery of blind or blindness is at work here. It is not really specifically concerned with physical blindness, as I mentioned, what it is, a spiritual or the teaching that certainly one would be receiving from those who are considered to be the teachers. Now, the other image that is used here is taking the speck out of your own eye, out of the eye of another, rather, when you have a log in your eye. Now, is there a bit of an exaggeration? Is that a technique here again being used by the gospel writer? I suspect that you kind of get the answer. We need to have, and this seems to be Luke, keep in mind now he's directing to his own audience, but at the same time, those who are supposedly the teachers, the importance of looking into their own lives to see if you have this speck in your eye, or rather you look for the speck in the eye of another and you have the log in your eye, maybe you better take care of looking at the log in your own eye first before you go about to telling others what they need to do. Now, I never know how much to go into this. There are some who point out that the imagery used here develops a sense of the human body, and that there are some who develop the human body into three symbolic zones, namely the eyes and heart, the mouth and ears, the hands and feet. So obviously this is developed the eyes to the heart. And as we've noted on many occasions, the heart is considered in this whole imagery to be the center of the human person. And it is there that understanding and wisdom, as well as emotion and feeling, are centered. Unlike where we've noticed this on other occasions, separate the mental, the brain, upstairs here, from here. Well, that wasn't the way in which this was understood by most in the cultures of the certainly Mediterranean world and of the early times. So, if Jesus is pictured here as saying that the heart is the central place from which all else flows, then it is important, and here he is talking to his own community and to those who would be reading this. This is what we need to do. We need to check our own selves. So, hypocrite putting on the mask might be okay if you're in the theater and if you're playing a role other than who you really are. But of course, we know so often it is used here to say, look, be looking at your own self, and look at our own community before we extend criticism to the others, the Pharisees. As we've noticed on many other occasions, and I simply reiterate the fact that although sometimes the Pharisees come across as very negative throughout the tradition of Christian interpretation, that the Pharisees who Luke's community would be addressing would be the official teachers of Israel after the fall of the city of Jerusalem in the year 70. And as we have noticed, that many of the leadership of the Pharisees had moved from Jerusalem, which had been destroyed, up to the north to the Galilee, and so that therefore their center was in that place. So if indeed, as the gospel maybe the community of Luke also was part of, settled in that area. You can see the tension that seemed to have developed between the two groups, namely the leadership of Israel and the developing Christian experience, many of whom still, even though Luke is very much concerned with the Hellenic world, and members of the community had come from Hellenic or Greek background, nevertheless the understanding of Judaism was playing an important part in how things were being developed. All right, so all of that really just to say that the rest of this chapter, which is not included in our reading this time, simply goes on to encourage Luke's community that it is important that they know the Word, that they appreciate the Word, but that they also act upon it in a favorable way. All right, I thought we'd spend a little bit of time looking at the first reading, which comes from the book of Sirach. Now, what we know about this book is that it is attributed to a man. Now, he has a very long name here, Joshua ben Eleazar ben Seir, or Sirach. He seems to have been a Jewish teacher of wisdom who was centered in Jerusalem and who wrote and who was thinking about 180, 175 before the common time. So roughly about 200 years before Jesus' time. He was quite familiar with and appreciative of the Greek way of life, and this included a philosophy, a culture, and a set of values. So that seems to be a little bit the background for Sirach. Now, according to this writer, a person's speech reveals much about them. External characteristics, such as one's speech, are the basis for judging others. Now, the Greek word is hux, which could mean dunghill, dung, a refuge. It's a jarring image. But a person's filth becomes obvious from what a person says. So see, from his point of view, you judge a person by what comes out of their mouth. Although in other places we know that Paul and even Jesus was certainly aware of how this kind of thinking could take place. Now he uses in the little section that we hear, and this is toward, by the way, you will know toward the ending of this book, chapter 27, and the whole idea that Sirach was writing these things down was to help a young person, particularly young men, who in some ways wanted to get ahead in society, wanted perhaps to get positions of teachers or wisdom leaders. Here are things that you should pay attention to. And as we have noticed also on other occasions, that much of the kind of thinking that comes here comes from experience. That is, not from kind of speculative thought, but from actual lived experience. And so we find here that he uses three images, namely the calendar. Now, excuse me, this is not something that, I don't mean a calendar with dates on, but something that you put in and grind out. Those of you who are of an older generation will remember that you perhaps put your cabbage or something into the calendar and it shredded it. All right. And so that's one of the images that he uses here, that they put the husks, the grain, into the calendar, grind it out, the grain came out, the good stuff, into into a container, and the rest, the chaff, was collected up and ultimately would be burned. So he says, we know that's how you get the good stuff, okay? You grind it out. Second image he uses here is that of the potter who it takes the clay and works it, and he's working in an oven, and always gets his hands. But if he doesn't like the shape that it is developed, he can easily just mush it back together again, and then continue to redevelop it. So the point that this illustration, so this is the second of the two, is that we should test others by their conversation. Test them by what they say. Again, notice this seems to be the theme that runs through much of what we're looking at this time. Do listeners test others by conversation, and do we sometimes pay attention to what people say and the way in which they say it when we are needing to make some kind of judgments, or even when we make judgments that we need not to make. So keep in mind, again, the practicality of this. And so then the third is the fruit tree. Now, fruit that is good will come from a tree that has been well cultivated. So it does, if it's just, if it's not taken care of, the fruit that comes from it is bad and therefore is not able to be used. So human speech, says Ben Sirach here, is whether a person is cultivated, well-trained, and firmly or finely disciplined. So all of that seems to be what this little section from Sirach is all about. And thus verse 7, which is the last of the ones that we hear, says, withhold judging others until he has spoken, and then his speech can be evaluated. We know a lot of people speak well. How we evaluate them. So not a lot more we can do here. If you look at what we've just examined, wisdom has been gleaned, as I suggested, from life experience. Life itself is a test of the value of these things, and you notice that the author has used three images from experience of life, namely agriculture, the colander, the arts, namely the development of the clay pots, and from horticulture, namely from how you kind of raise things, all right, and taking care of the tree and needing to, cultivate it and take care of it and do all of that. So those seems to be the reason why this particular section has been chosen. And so to conclude what Sirach is saying, maybe three things. First, impressions are not always accurate. Secondly, it's impossible to fashion a pot that will endure without firing it in a kiln. So you can't develop, you got to get a little close to the fire on this one for the pot to be appropriately developed. And then thirdly, care needs to be given to the tree. So again, if you think about it, in this very little section, Sirach has given a lot of advice that comes from experience, namely from what people actually do in life. So Jesus, now whether or not Jesus really was paying attention to what Sirach was saying, or whether the liturgists have brought that in, you can see how that might work. Finally, just concluding with the understanding that Paul has in the second reading that we hear, very important section, which is and I encourage you to go back and maybe look at it again, the whole chapter. Again, we have broken it up over the last couple weeks into parts, and sometimes we lose the sense of the wholeness, where Paul had started to remember by saying that there were those who were witnesses to the risen Jesus. This is the first evidence, by the way, in the scriptural tradition to the resurrection. Paul, who writes to the Corinthians around the year 50, so that certainly makes it one of the first kind of written works that deal with the resurrection. And then Paul had said that along with Peter and some of the other disciples, he himself was a witness to the risen Jesus. And if Jesus has not been risen, then our faith is vain, and we have been fooled. And he goes on to, as you read through this section, point out the importance of believing in the resurrection, that our faith rests in that, and that indeed there are those who find it difficult and may even challenge this, but we as believers keep to our faith, keep to our hearts the fact of Jesus' resurrection. So I encourage, as we prepare now to enter into this Lenten season, perhaps to look again at this particular important and beautiful section of Paul's writing. So this week we will commence the season of Lent. Once again, an opportunity that is presented, and the readings for this coming Wednesday are very traditional. You could certainly check them out. In our Christian or Catholic tradition, Ash Wednesday turns out to be one of the few days that we encourage the community to practice the both fasting and abstinence. And what might be important here, whether you and there are only 2 days in which this is really asked, namely Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, and the Fridays of Lent are also suggested as times of abstinence. But the importance of this practice is not that it is something simply that I do or that you do, but it's something that we do. And perhaps that's what makes the placing of the ashes on our forehead. And by the way, those of you who want it the way it used to be done, they'll just dump it all over on your head, and it can kind of fall down and grind into your body until it reaches your feet. Try that if you want to do something a little bit more challenging as we enter this season. Well, be that as it may, thank you for being with us today, and we'll hopefully see you again in our new season.